And hello and welcome to our audience joining us from across the globe. I'm Raymond Karam, the Chief Program and Development Officer here at the Arab Gulf States Institute. We're happy to have you all with us today as we host a discussion assessing Syria's path toward reconstruction as the country emerges from over a decade of conflict that truly devastated its socio-economic fabric. And we have with us an exceptional panel of experts. I'll introduce them very briefly here and add a link to their full bios in the chat. First, I'd like to welcome Natasha Hall. She's a senior associate, non-resident at CSIS. She has over 15 years of experience as an analyst, researcher, and practitioner in complex humanitarian emergencies and conflict-affected areas in the Middle East. Her work is focused on conflict resolution, governance, displacement, environmental issues, and civilian protection, and her reports have spurred congressional hearings and a high-level donor response on Syria. Welcome back to Ibrahim Hamidi. He's a senior journalist and the executive editor of Majalla, a current affairs magazine focused on the Arab world, and a senior diplomatic editor for Syria affairs at Bashar al-Assad. He's one of the founders of Salon Syria, a website that trains Syrian journalists and promote freedom of expression. Previously, he was the Damascus bureau chief of the Arab daily newspaper Al-Hayat for 22 years and contributes to several other international media outlets and think tanks. Another warm welcome to Laith Alajlouni. He is a senior research associate at the IISS Middle East office in Manama, Bahrain. With a background as a political economist, his research focuses on issues of geoeconomics and strategy in the Middle East. Prior to IISS, he worked as an economist and social research consultant at various institutions, including the World Bank and the Jordan Strategy Forum. Last but not least is Joseph Tahir. He is a Swiss-Syrian academic and expert on the political economy of the Middle East. He's the author of several books, including Hezbollah, The Political Economy of Lebanon's Party of God, and Syria After the Uprisings, published in 2019. He has taught at several universities, including the University of Lausanne in Switzerland and Ghent University in Belgium. And moderating the session today is Ambassador William Roebuck. He is the Executive Director of AGSI. Executive Vice President, apologies, of AGSI. Before joining us here, Bill was a member of the United States Foreign Service, retiring from the Department of State in 2020 after a 28-year career. From 2018 to 2020, he was embedded with U.S. Special Forces in Northeast Syria, serving as Deputy Special Envoy for the Global Coalition against ISIS. Before that, he served as Ambassador to Bahrain from 2015 to 2017. And with that, Bill, over to you.
Thank you, Raymond. Welcome, everyone. We're delighted to be with you today. We have a very talented panel assembled to tackle this difficult issue of reconstruction in Syria. As we move through the discussion, I think you'll note several fundamental clusters of issues. We'll start by looking at the situation on the ground in Syria, 8 months after the fall of the Assad regime, and consider how those realities create challenges for reconstruction. And these realities include security issues, the Shara government's performance and intentions, the humanitarian situation, and Syria's war-damaged economy. These are all huge challenges after more than a decade of war. Then we'll look directly at issues related to physical reconstruction, the country's specific needs, and the damage that it has sustained since 2011. And we'll consider the financial costs for addressing these massive requirements. We'll also review the international players involved, the key states in the region, and more broadly, in light of their interests in Syria and their potential for investing or steering investment to Syria. And as for the international institutions, we'll examine their ability to provide financing, planning, coordination, and capacity building. We'll then try to broaden the discussion a bit on reconstruction and look at some of the non-physical elements that tie in with rebuilding Syria's massively damaged infrastructure. For example, questions related to who plans reconstruction, who gets to have input in shaping priorities. Is there a connection between reconstruction and Syria's political transition, including things like the need for inclusiveness, representative government, a new constitution, and so forth. And finally, I'll give our panelists the opportunity at the end to address worst-case scenarios or the case for optimism as they choose to end their remarks. This is a discussion, as Raymond made clear. We welcome input from you, the audience. Please, as Raymond said, use the Q&A function to ask your questions, and I'll relay them to the panel. Members of the panel, if you would like to interject something on a question that I've directed to another member, just let me know, raising your hand through the Zoom function or just saying to me, and I will give you a chance to also make some remarks. So let's jump right into this. I thought we would start with security issues and get a laydown from Ibrahim about the the situation on the ground in Syria and the challenges that it or they really could pose for reconstruction. Ibrahim, could you talk a little bit about the security situation and the pressures that the Bashar government is under?
Thank you so much. Of course, thank you so much, my dear friend Bill, and thank you, Raymond, for your kind introduction. It's a great pleasure to be with such distinguished panelists and friends. I am the editor-in-chief of Majalla, but I'm not speaking on behalf of Majalla. I'm just expressing my personal views. So, back to your question, my dear friend. If I may, I mean, the regime, Bashar al-Assad regime, has fallen about 7-8 months ago. I can talk about two stages. The first stage, in the last, in the first 3 to 4 months, the new regime led by Ahmed Shara got a carte blanche from all stakeholders. I mean, even from the Syrians, they got wide support from the Syrians. They got Arab support led by Saudi Arabia, and they got regional support led by the Turks, and even they got unprecedented European support. And on top of all of that, they got support from the Trump administration. All of them, all the stakeholders, except Iran, maybe Russia, but now today is interesting. The visit of the foreign minister of Syria to Russia is interesting as well. So they got, the new regime got support from all main stakeholders. What was interesting that if we go back to the narrative at that time, most of the stakeholders, they believed that there was a strategic shift. That was the biggest strategic defeat for Iran since 1979. Iran was weakened strategically. Hezbollah was weakened. So the new regime, the fall of Assad, led to the dismantling the Captagon, the drugs networks in Syria. So everybody was happy with the strategic shift, and they did not care much about the domestic issue, actually. I was following all meetings between the Syrian new leaders and the other visitors, other stakeholders. Rarely the Syrian domestic issue was mentioned. Now, that has started to change gradually after the clashes, the bloody clashes, atrocities in the coast in March. We had the atrocities in the coastal area in west of Syria, and then we had clashes in Germana next to Damascus, Ashrafit Sahaya. But I would say the turning point was the clashes 10 days ago, middle of July, between Bedouins, tribes, and the Druze, and then the intervention from the government. That led to big shift in terms of narrative from some Arab countries, from Europeans, and even from the Americans. Now we can tell easily the domestic issues when it comes to the atrocities, accountability, constitution, election. Now it is part of the discussion. It is part of the discussion that I know in private meetings, more than in public meetings, most of the people who met with the Syrian officials recently, they started to raise the questions about those big issues: accountability, election, political process, constitution. I think this is interesting change. What the other interesting element, I think, as well at that time, is that in the middle of all of this, we saw few developments. One of them, there was 2 telephone calls between the Syrian president, Ahmed Shara, the interim president, Shara, with the president of Turkey, and with the crown prince of Saudi Arabia, Prince Mohammed bin Salman. And then after that, there was high-level visit from a businessman delegation led by the Minister of Investment from Saudi Arabia to Damascus. My understanding, the message was is that more political than it's related to business. So the message still is that we are here to help. We want to help you to maintain stability in Syria, and we will give you as much as of support so that you can improve the process that you are leading. The main reason is that I think it goes back to what I was saying in the beginning, because of the strategic shift. Most of the stakeholders until now, they believe there has been a strategic change in the region, and we should not miss this opportunity. And they believe if this government is weakened, the alternative is going to be worse, and that might lead to chaos. And if there is chaos, then ISIS will be re-emerged, and then that might lead for Iran would once again will play a role in Syria. So yeah, so this is the way I see it now. Maybe we can talk more in details throughout the discussion.
Thank you, Ibrahim. Joseph, I wanted to come to you on this issue as well. The broader political dynamics, security issues in Syria, but also if you would talk a little bit about your perceptions about the Shara government, how you assess their performance, their intentions, and how they can have an impact on reconstruction efforts, how we, meaning the international community, could put some pressure, in your view, to include a broader range of voices. Any of those issues, I'd welcome your perspective.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be on the same panel with very important and honorable speakers. Regarding your question, I think what is clear is that since the fall of the Assad regime in December, what we've been witnessing with what I would describe as the construction in process of a new authoritarian regime, which is not complete, which is not achieved because of the lack of human, military, political capacities of the new ruling elite led by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. But this process is ongoing. And therefore, we have not been witnessing any kind of political transition, but rather a consolidation of power. How does this consolidation of power occur? First of all, it was based mostly on international recognition, especially by Western powers, Gulf monarchies, regional actors, and to root basically Syria in a new form of islands led by the US. Why this? Because it was a path towards which we witness a process of lifting the sanctions and welcoming foreign direct investment. And contrary to what we heard from the statements of the government officials, we're not witnessing a rupture with previous economic policies, but rather a continuation and a deepening, whether regarding privatization policies of state assets, commercial dynamics, or the welcoming of foreign direct investment. But the key difference is the new axis of alliance that is rooted with Western powers at its head, obviously the US, in which it includes as well normalization with Israel in the near future. And I agree with Ibrahim by saying that there was not, and this is not new, the interest into a democratization process by international actors, regardless of who. I never have been, if we look at the region, whether the US, the European, Gulf monarchies have never been interested by a democratization process in Syria, but rather a form of authoritarian stability. And the problem that we witness is that if this government, interim government, is able to achieve a form of authoritarian stability, Western actors, Gulf monarchies will be very happy. But what we witness is basically, despite and in addition to the lack of any kind of inclusive and political transition, I mean, If we look at the National Dialogue Day, the so-called United National Government, the Constitutional Declaration, there's no participation or inclusion. It's a monopolization, centralization of power within Ahmed al-Sharia and HTS affiliates. But the key problem is the fact that this authority and stability have been challenged by the massacres committed by, and as showed and demonstrated by Reuters report, in the coastal areas. And unfortunately, again, we witnessed a lack of transparency from the committee in charge of the investigation, denying any form of participation or knowledge of high echelons of the state. And again, new massacres. And unfortunately, we should say that the siege on Sweden is not ended, and that the government forces played a direct role in trying to take control fully of Sweden through force, and not without any kind of political dialogue. And I think Sweden events demonstrates the fact that we're not witnessing any form of political transition, but consolidation of power. So first of all, it was an international recognition to consolidate its power within the country, trying to consolidate its power in the major institutions of the state, army, security services, government, establishing actually parallel institutions to the government in the hand of HTS affiliates or Ahmed al-Sharia. And even lastly, we witnessed that there's a process of trying to capture wealth by former businessmen affiliated with the presidential palace to the direct interest of the, I would say, the new presidential palace led by Ahmed al-Sharia. So this affects the reconstruction, lack of political transition, lack of inclusion, lack of local participation. But economically speaking, I think it's also important to say that this reconstruction has mostly, in its dynamics for the moment, is led for a tiny minority of Syrians and businessmen affiliated with Ahmed al-Sharia. And actually, we've seen cuts in subsidies that affect the vast majority of Syrian population, which are 90% of the population. We have very negative effect. So all in all, for the moment, I would say whether the political transition that is absent or the reconstruction effort, the direction that is taking is quite dangerous for the future of the majority of the Syrian population.
Thank you, Joseph. I'm going to move on in a second to Natasha to give us a lay down on the humanitarian situation. But Ibrahim, I wanted to give you just a second to, if you have a different view of the Shara government, or if you wish to respond to the assessment that Joseph has given of the Shara government, because I hear you, Joseph. You made some really cogent points. It is, I think, remarkable, at least in the first months of their rule, their diplomatic successes. Ibrahim, I wonder if you want to comment on the character of the Shara government and their what they have succeeded in doing.
I mean, Joseph, my friend, I'm sure he's following Syria much closer than I do, because I look at it from a bit from far. But I will make 2 points. One is that if we go back to the press release after the meeting between Trump and Shara in Riyadh, 14th of May, I think the White House said that Trump made 5 demands: joining Abraham Accords, ISIS camps northeast of Syria, expel Palestinian groups, and chemical weapons. None of the demands is related to the domestic issues in Syria. None of them is related to transition, political transition, or accountability, elections. I think most of the stakeholders were not really interested in the domestic issue. Just they were happy, as I said, with the strategic shift that took place in Syria after the fall of Bashar al-Assad, and that which led to the strategic defeat of Iran. The second point that I would like to make as I said, Joseph knows Syria and follows Syria more than I do closely. But because I've been there a few times, until now, I think the Syrian regime, the structure of regime, still is in the making. I agree that there are atrocities. I agree that there were massacres. I agree that there are some tensions for authoritarianism. But I think if we compare Syria to other experiences in the region, if we compare it to Syria to Iran revolution or what happened in 1979 or to what happened in Iraq after the American invasion or Libya, or until now, I think the structure of the Syrian regime is still in the making, and it could go either way. That's why, just final, that's why I think, I mean, I know there are several private secret visits to Damascus, and some of them are public. I know. As I said, I think what I notice is now the narrative of the stakeholders started to change privately. Now there is more interest from the stakeholders when they talk to the officials in Damascus is that really you have to change course. If you want stability, reconstruction, blah blah blah, you need to change course domestically. Until now, it is private, but we'll see what will happen in the future.
Thank you, Ibrahim. Natasha, could I move to you now? I wonder if you would describe what is really a fundamental second challenge to reconstruction, which is the humanitarian situation. Could you give us a description of the humanitarian catastrophe, really, that has been Syria for the last number of years, and your sense about how it impacts reconstruction efforts or will impact them?
Yeah, thank you, Ambassador, for the invitation, and great to be on the same panel with Ibrahim and Joseph and Laith. I mean, I'd like to answer that question in two parts. I think I've struggled for the past several years to get people to understand that it shouldn't just be about humanitarian aid. It's about an entire political and economic landscape, which I think is right now more hopeful than it has been in many years, but also more fragile than it's been in many years. So if I could, I want to answer that question in a couple of parts. From, I think, also the US policy angle as one of the biggest donors to humanitarian aid historically during this war. And that's first, I think, the seemingly incoherent policy when it comes to Syria regarding aid on the one hand and sanctions relief on the other. And secondly, the inadequacy of humanitarian aid prior to the fall of Assad, and certainly now. The fact that we're even talking about humanitarian aid still at this moment really means that we're not meeting this historic moment in Syria, which really requires, I would argue, more of a Marshall Plan than what we're seeing. And instead, we're seeing this patchwork kind of nature that is allowing various regional players to embark on their own interests rather than having some kind of cohesive plan for reconstruction, which I would argue would necessitate security sector reform, a national reconciliation, et cetera. I don't think that these are nice things to have, as Joseph, outlined. These are things that are necessary for stability and development in Syria. I mean, it's good to see that most of the major NGOs, the aid organizations, received permission to go to Sweden yesterday, actually. But, we're talking about more than food baskets right now. If we're lifting sanctions, this means we have a country that is open to markets more broadly. So we really shouldn't be talking about food baskets anymore. So, I mean, first, I mentioned Syria sort of needs and deserves a Marshall Plan. But the US and I think others sort of seem hell-bent on continuing to view Syria as a sideshow until, of course, it isn't. And until, of course, all of this spirals out of control and suddenly we have more forces in Syria. And so I think, it needs to start from the point that we view Syria as a country that is literally a keystone in the region. It even looks like a keystone in the region, that it is actually strategically very important. This isn't just an altruistic need to stabilize and develop the country. There are strategic reasons for this. And instead, we have an administration here that, to its credit, is trying to lift sanctions, but it simultaneously withdrew aid. And I think, more directly to your point, and I've been writing about this for years because we've seen donor fatigue over the years. But right now what we're seeing is quite devastating. We had already seen the closure of health facilities in recent years, thousands of job losses in the country, and that was even prior to US aid being dismantled. And as I said, either the first or the second biggest donor to the humanitarian response in Syria and the surrounding countries being withdrawn with the Trump administration. I mean, anecdotally, everyone I know is getting sick when they go to Syria, and that's not surprising because a big portion of US aid was distributing hygiene kits with sanitation, provision of clean water, and we've seen that almost eliminated for nearly 1 million people. And we're going to need to see more of that as time goes on, not just water trucks and things like that, but the rehabilitation of electricity grids, sewage networks, water grids. I personally know people that are going back to their villages and there's nothing there. There's no grids, there's no networks, there's no trees, there's no houses. And so there's a surge of waterborne diseases, and that shouldn't really surprise anyone. On top of all of that, we have one of the biggest droughts that we've seen in 60 years. So we're going to expect more food insecurity as time goes on. And a lot of NGOs that had been working in Syria had to eliminate a lot of their nutrition programs. And the UN is estimating that probably 2/3 of the population are going to need foreign aid this year. So there's that side of the coin, and that doesn't even take into consideration the millions of people in the surrounding countries that probably hope to return to Syria, but they have nothing to return to, which again, I think underlines and emphasizes the strategic nature of trying to help Syria rebuild in an equal and just way. And I'm not even talking about sort of the power grid issues and, the few hours of electricity a day makes, reconstruction and development all the more challenging. And, as I said, I think this is going to be an even bigger issue because we're actually covering a larger area of land. If you expect IDPs and refugees to return to places that have been essentially demolished, then you're actually going to need to increase aid rather than decrease it at this time. And, the second point is that we frankly, we shouldn't be talking about humanitarian aid anymore. We need to be talking about major development stabilization support, security sector reform, national reconciliation. If something is done through the private sector, which I think a lot of it needs to be, then we should have transparent deals on the table that ensure that these companies are cleaning up after themselves and giving back to the communities they work in. Or else we're going to see a Lebanon type situation, Iraq type of situation where you have wildcatters come in and making their own profits with politicians skimming off the top. This is just the equation of a post-conflict context. This isn't because of the Bashar government or any other government. This is just how it ends up working in a lot of conflict-affected environments. And so, I think to answer your question more broadly, I think it's never just been about aid or humanitarian aid, not before Assad fell and not after. It's about this political and economic landscape. And to the point of, the previous speakers, there's very few conditions on the lifting of sanctions. Now, I think sanctions should be lifted entirely without conditions, but conditions can still be applied in the aftermath of that. And we don't really see any of that with regards to the internal dynamics within Syria. We see protection of minorities, which has been sort of added to a recent bill, and combating the Captagon trade. But we don't see a lot on how are we going to do banking reform? How are we going to do deals when it comes to investment and reconstruction? There's none of that. And the reality is that's where a lot of the issues, the longstanding issues are going to arise. And that's where we're going to see a lot of these deals, these MOUs being signed, et cetera, throughout the country that aren't trickling down to regular Syrians. And we're going to wind up exactly where we were 14 years ago when the Syrian war started, except much worse off because there's a lot more weapons in the country and a lot more trauma and division as well.
Thank you, Natasha. Laith, I'd like to bring you into this discussion on the humanitarian side. And Natasha referenced it a little bit. I wonder if you have other observations to add about the impact of U.S. assistance being withdrawn in such an abrupt and massive way, and just overall your assessment of the humanitarian assistance picture in Syria.
Yeah, thank you, Ambassador Roebuck, for facilitating this discussion, and many thanks for the AGSI for convening this session. I will touch upon the humanitarian situation, and I will also address why the current Syrian government cannot address the humanitarian situation on its own. So, as Natasha mentioned, the U.S. aid freeze is estimated to be around 237 million US dollars for 2025, and this directly led to the suspension of the World Food Program food assistance to around 3.2 million Syrians who need this food assistance. As Natasha mentioned also healthcare facilities were shut down, and also many civil society organizations that work on transitional justice, economic, political participation, rule of law, and other areas that are important for a just transition in Syria lost their funding, which those organizations have a very important role in the current phase of Syria. Now, why the Syrian government need high levels of assistance from the international community and even the Arab nations? If you look at the macro fiscal situation in Syria, debt to GDP ratio in Syria is now 128%, and that might be even underestimated due to the lack of robust financial statistics from the government of Syria. Government revenues are only 9.9% of GDP. This is 51% down of the pre-war levels. 67% of Syrians are living under $4 a day. Tax revenues for the government are 2.5% to the GDP. When it comes to the external account, the current account, for example, exports went from 8.8 billion US dollars in 2010 to 1.3 billion in 2023. And the cost of construction is massive. The current estimates of reconstruction costs are somewhere between 400 billion US dollars and 1 trillion US dollars. This is massive money. Now, the only way to get over this is to attract FDI and foreign aid to rebuild the country and to do economic reform. Now, maybe I will elaborate on economic reform later a little bit, but the current measures, and I agree to some extent with Joseph, the current economic reform measures include public sector reform by laying off around 400,000 civil servants, reducing subsidies for bread, fuel, cooking gas, and electricity, tax reforms, and other reforms. These reforms can indicate some sort of, I think, in addition to privatization, these reforms, I think, indicate some sort of mechanisms for rewarding loyalists and unequally redistribute power and finances to the public. And in the lack of a constitution, accountability mechanisms, a parliament, a freely elected parliament, I think these reforms can be misused for the purposes of power consolidation. That's where the international community can play a role, and that's where investors can play a role. Because investors, at the end of the day, they will need to make sure that their investments not at least pay off politically and from a security point of view, not only financially. I can elaborate on that later on. Yeah, but that's how I see the current socioeconomic / humanitarian situation in Syria.
Thank you, Laith. We're going to come back to the economy, to the economic situation in a second. I want to, and I'm aware our my good friend Ibrahim has got to leave a bit early, so I want to take advantage of him while he's still with us. And I have a question for you, Ibrahim, from the audience, or maybe two questions I'll package together. One is about the role of public opinion in Syria. Let me just give you the question as it's stated. How much of a role do you think public opinion in Syria will play as authorities come under pressure from more militant elements? Assuming that there are policy differences between the militants and current authorities. I think there's really two elements in that question. One is, what type of tensions do you see between more militant elements and the government, the Bashar government? And then how is public opinion in Syria affecting that dynamic, or more broadly, is it being listened to?
Thank you, Bill.
And the other question real quick is just and we'll have to do it sort of in a short fashion because it's not really our main focus, is the situation in the Northeast and tensions between the SDF and Syrian National Army, other elements up there that are sort of having clashes in Deir ez-Zor province. Is this a major concern for the government?
Thank you, Bill. With pleasure. I'm sure Joseph knows it well. What was interesting, the first few months, that the interim government in Damascus was very much responsive to the public opinion. It happened several times. You remember the first 3 months, like the Salvation government of Idlib moved to Damascus, and they made a few bad decisions, and they were very much responsive to comments on social media, on public opinion, and they reversed and changed a lot of their decisions related to issues, domestic issues. I think now this started to change because the government started to be more confident. They have become less responsive to the public opinion. What is interesting, and I hope Joseph can comment on this. What is interesting now, we witnessed recently. Now there is new elite, new influencers who are very much loyalist to the current government, and they are playing big role to pave the way to the official narrative, and they really can make. I mean, it's very obvious now. The new government is counting more on social media influencer than counting on professional journalists and professional journalism. This is with regard to the first question. When it comes to the armed groups, I don't know. I was told. I don't know if you heard it. I was told that actually, even the government said it publicly that they lost control over some of their armed groups, whether it was in the coastal area in March, whether it was in the clashes in Sweden. And I was told by someone that they lost control over 58,000 fighters in Sweden. Like they were at certain point, they were not really able to control the fight. I don't know whether that was said as justification or whether it was true, but it's obvious that there was not full control by the government over the all armed groups. When it comes to Northeast, actually, this question should be directed to you, William, because you follow Northeast more than I do. I mean, I think all of us know the whole picture, but what is like the latest is that we know that Ahmed al-Shara, Mazloum Abdi signed agreement 10th of March, last March, and then they were supposed to implement it. We know there are two major differences. One over the future of SDF, how they will join the new Syrian army. The second is the future of the local administration northeast of Syria, and the relation, the balance between decentralization and central government. So I think both parties say that this agreement was not implemented. They were supposed, Mazloum Abdi was supposed to meet the Syrian foreign minister in Paris last Friday, or the two weeks ago. It did not happen. And then the French foreign minister with the U.S. envoy plus plus Syrian minister met in Paris. And I think, my understanding, now they are supposed to meet very soon in Paris. Kurdish delegation, SDF delegation, with the Syrian foreign minister to try to draw a roadmap to implement a 10th of March agreement.
Thank you, Ibrahim. I wonder, Joseph, if we could transition a bit, and if I could ask you to, as we move into the direct considerations of reconstruction, if you could talk a little bit about the scope of the problem. What are we talking about in Syria in terms of reconstruction that is required? The level of destruction, damage, the costs that will be involved. Laith referenced it to a limited degree when he was making his initial remarks. Can you give us a little bit more detail on that?
Yes, Ambassador. We have to acknowledge the huge challenges facing any reconstruction effort in Syria, regardless of the political dynamics. As you asked, let's concentrate on the economic dynamics and the challenges. When it comes to destructions of infrastructures, housing, what we mean, the real kind of destruction is the value estimates are around 120 billion. When we talk about 400 billion or trillion loss is according to the growth that could have been expected in the case there was no war. So it's a bit of a difference. But in terms of infrastructure, we're over 100 billion. And this is where, and maybe we'll come back to this later on, no one denies that Syria is in need of continuous humanitarian assistance, but also development, foreign direct investment, but where to direct it. And if we notice, lots of the current foreign direct investments, except few in infrastructures, are into kind of similar domains and dynamics that prior to the war. Meaning, we're announcing big malls, big real estate projects. And in many ways, what we're witnessing is very much the way the government is presenting its kind of reconstruction effort or economic recovery. And we find similar personalities, actually. The beginning of the 2000s, when Bashar al-Assad came to power with its kind of economic reforms, privatization, etc. But to come back to reconstruction effort, what is key is, for example, electricity sector. And here, if we look, there's been a memorandum of understanding with a couple of companies led by the Qatari-based company, UCC, which is actually led and owned by Syrian Qatari personalities that are affiliated with the former business tycoon Mohammed Hamsho, and have quite good relationship with the Qatari leadership. So they promised, billions of dollars investment in electricity, which is absolutely a necessity, because electricity cost in Syria, not only that Syria lacks electricity, and not only for individuals, but for the economic sector, but the problem is the electricity cost is the most expensive throughout the region. The cost of production in Syria is very often more important than regional countries, except when it comes to salaries to the working force. But this has direct consequences of any possible economic recovery. And here, again, we see contradictions with the policy programs of the government and the ability to rebuild productive sectors of the economy, manufacturing industry and agriculture, which are today, and if you speak with industrialists, farmers today, they can't compete, for example, with Turkish products that have, massively been imported to Syria, even more than prior to the fall of the region. If we compare year to year, the first 5 months we witnessed a total volume of export from Turkey to Syria of $1 billion, which is 40% over to last year. Most of the industrialists cannot compete. They have not the competitivity with Turkish manufacturing industry, especially after 14 years of war. So electricity is key. We need to rebuild electricity networks. But here again, we see a problem with the nature of the contract. First of all, there's a lack of transparency. How was this contract? What was the process, etc. But the content, some of the electricity units that will be built by this private company is not under the framework of build, operate, transfer, as it has been historically for the region or Syria, even prior to the fall of the Assad regime, but under the framework of build, operate, and own. This means it's a private company that will distribute electricity, decide of its cost. So if you're a small economic actor, which, as a reminder, and this is one of the problems in the reconstruction perspective in the current government, but just as the former government, as a reminder, Syria private sector is composed of 99% of micro, small, and medium enterprise that lack financial assistance from the banks, that lack technology updates, that lack skilled workers, or etc. But how will SMEs afford, high cost of electricity? The big, kind of manufacturers, big landowners can afford it. But what about the small and medium, which is the basic for any kind of reconstruction effort? If we look also at the transport network, which, historically speaking, even the previous government had been trying to promote Syria because it's at the center, in terms of geographically speaking, of the Middle East, Turkey to the Gulf. Transport networks have been largely affected. There's a big necessity of reconstruction, which could replace Syria as a center, of commercial trade, transport, etc. Also, when it comes to, reconstruction of oil facilities is also absolutely needed. It's mostly in the Northeast, but also refineries. There's a necessity of investment. And we haven't touched on the necessity of investment into housing. But here again, what we're already seeing, for example, in certain areas of Homs, publicities to build and not to rebuild, to build big real estate luxurious project on the model of, what we've seen in the Gulf, Lebanon after 90s. But what about the plans? And for anyone that went to Syria, Damascus countryside, Joba, Harasta, what about Aleppo? No, it's about a reconstruction that is targeting areas, or if you want, dynamics that favor rapid capital accumulation and not reconstruction of housing planning for the large majority of Syrians. And this is what our previous speakers were saying. For Syrians to come back to what? Massive destruction of infrastructures, lack of provision of work opportunities. So this is only a short resume. I can expand on it, but the challenges that we're facing in terms of reconstruction. Maybe we could talk also the necessity to reform the financial system that will play a key role for any kind of reconstruction effort. And here, again, we need a new policy, because prior to 2011, when you had the expansion of private banking in Syria, most of the private banking sector did not have any kind of developmental role. And this is a problem that we find throughout the Middle East, saying that basically most of the loans made by the private banks were not towards promoting SMEs, but rather consumption dynamics, buying a car, buying a house. If you look at very dynamic society, economic society, banks do have also a developmental role. And this is not as well promoted by the current government. So these are kind of the few challenges regarding the reconstruction effort.
Thank you, Joseph. Laith, Joseph has raised some really salient issues about how these early steps in reconstruction are taking place in Syria. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about some of the international institutions that should be involved in this, and maybe the role as you see it, how they can play a role in helping coordinate this, in helping ensure some of these things that Joseph is talking about, whether it's repairing the transportation network or making sure that electricity is repaired in a way that makes it affordable for people, etc. Many problems. There clearly is a need for more comprehensive planning, coordination, loans at concessional rates. Who will be involved in this? Is it the World Bank's International Bank for Reconstruction and Development? Is it the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development? I saw the IMF was recently in Syria in early June. How do you see that picture coming together with international institutions, maybe helping get a grip and getting some organization into this overall effort?
Yeah. Currently, the picture is quite mixed. What we see is that more of an active role of governments rather than international organizations. So we saw some European governments, European investors, and Gulf governments and Gulf investors who are willing to spend both political and financial capital to invest in to stabilize Syria. So, for example, when it comes to the Gulf, we saw Saudi Arabia introducing al-Shara to Trump, lobbying the American administration to lift sanctions, lobbying the Congress to eliminate the Caesar Act. We saw the UAE mediating between al-Shara and Israel, and so on. And that's because, like Europe, the Gulf is interested in having a stable Syria domestically and a stable region, as Ibrahim mentioned, to counter Iran influence and to counter maybe Israel trials to build influence in Syria and destabilize Syria. And that was translated into financial capital. So we saw Saudi Arabia, for example, investing around $6 billion across announcing to invest $6 billion across different sectors, including real estate, construction, critical infrastructure, which Joseph mentioned, financial services that Joseph also mentioned, logistics and fintech and telecommunications, among other sectors. Qatar also will be investing in building power plants that are expected to add 10,000 megawatts of electric capacity to Syria, and we saw the UAE investing in the logistics sector by investing by DP World investment and building land ports and rebuilding the Tartus port. We also see French investments. We saw CMA CGM interested in building land ports and the Latqiya port, and we saw other Turkish investments in the energy sector and the gas sector, in addition to other countries that expressed interests. So, for example, Kuwaitis expressed interests in the telecommunication sector in Syria. The US some US companies will be investing in the electricity sector. So all of these investments are crucial. Now, when it comes to international organizations, yes, we saw the IMF in Syria, but at the same time, the picture is mixed. Ahmed al-Shara and his government made multiple announcements that they will not use the IMF, or the IMF funds, which I'm skeptical about. At the end of the day, Syria is a country that has just came out of conflict. They don't have even a credit rating. So the Syrian government says it's planning to go to international markets and issue bonds in the local market. I'm not sure a country with such level of instability and without a credit rating, how they can raise funds from the international markets. They will pay high interest rates on these bonds. So I think they will eventually go to the International Monetary Fund, World Bank, to raise more concessional funding for reconstruction. And again, as Joseph mentioned, the financial sector in Syria will play a role. The Emiratis, for example, expressed their interest in expanding their banking sector to Syria and building branches in Syria. The Jordanian banking sector is already expanding onto Syria, and foreign banks currently are much better position to do business in Syria and fund projects in Syria than Syrian national banks, because they took multiple financial hits due to the war and the devaluation of the Syrian lira. So yeah, and again, I would also worry if that the Syrian government would rely pretty much on domestic funding, domestic finances, they will crowd out also the private sector that is planning to invest and rebuild Syria.
Thank you, Laith. Ibrahim, not sure how much time you've got left, but just wondering if you want to comment on the role of the Gulf states in investing and playing a critical role in Syria and its overall reconstruction.
Yes, I just have 2 minutes.
Okay.
Briefly and quickly, as Laith and Joseph said already, I think in the last few months we have already seen a lot of good intentions. We have seen many MOUs have been signed between different companies from different countries, mainly Turkey, Qatar, United Emirates, but mainly Saudi Arabia. I think what I can see is that there is and of course the sanctions been lifted. The US and European, Canada, Japan sanctions been lifted, and Switzerland as well. But so we have seen in the last 7-8 months good intentions from different stakeholders. Look, we're interested to do investment, to be involved in reconstruction. But have we seen something concrete yet? I'm not sure. I mean, I'm sure Joseph and Laith will be in better position to answer this. Does Syria have enough infrastructure? Do we have enough expertise in Syria? Do we have enough experts back from outside back to Syria? Is it really that I know that sanctions have been lifted, but really, is it easy now to transfer money to Syria? I am not sure. Until now, what I've seen, as I said, good intentions, but maybe we need more time. We need better infrastructure in Syria. We need better administration system to be able to translate that into action. This is my impression. But once again, I'm sure Joseph and Laith could elaborate more.
Thank you, Ibrahim, and thank you for participating with us.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you so much. Cheers.
Yes.
Thank you.
Joseph, what about these questions that Ibrahim has raised regarding the role of Gulf investment? Is there enough expertise in Syria now to absorb it? Is there enough infrastructure to absorb it? Sanctions have been lifted conceptually, but for example, transferring money, is that really been eased completely, or is it still an issue? Any response to some of these questions that Ibrahim raised about Gulf and other international states, players?
Yes, Ambassador, thank you. I'm sure also Laith and Natasha can join in because they worked on these subjects as well. But when it comes to the sanction, first of all, I think it's important to clarify that the process of lifting of sanction is not complete. And this is also provoking, a form of unwillingness. I'm not saying by big economic actors. If we notice the biggest economic actors that have, invested in Syria, when we look at, the UCC kind of company, led Qatar company, we look at CGA, CGM, we look at Dubai Port World, they all have state backing. What we need for Syria for the future is that also the diaspora, Syrian diaspora, feel at ease to invest. We feel, middle, large-sized actor, but not necessarily with state support to invest in Syria. And without a total lifting of sanctions, on the economy and the state, after we can put aside, I'm in favor, for example, of sanctions on particular personalities, institutions that committed crimes, which is still the case within the current so-called new Syrian National Army. So this process must be completely lifted. Without this clear process, I don't think we'll have the complete red flag being removed on Syria, even from the financial system. And this is quite important because there's still forms of blockade. There's still, not complete, full confidence that dealing with Syria is acceptable. Knowing that, regarding the Caesar sanction that still need to be completely lifted, it's every 6 months. So it's something temporary. And when you need long-term investment, you cannot count on 6 months. Basically, it's not enough. When it comes to infrastructure, everything is obviously to rebuild. And this is part of the need to have foreign aid, foreign investment, but also a place for the state. But how to bring back skilled workers when you have the minimum public minimum salary in Syria today is between $70 to $80. The cost of life for a family of 5 in Damascus is at minimum $600. How do you want to bring them back, even in the private sector? So here you need to increase salaries for already people to survive and not to live, and not to survive. Otherwise, and this is what I often say, Syria is more and more becoming its economy like Lebanon, with all the respect I have for my Lebanese friends and colleagues, meaning that it's a country that is completely dependent on foreign sources of funding, whether remittances, and for the large majority, Syrians are dependent today on remittances, which is between 4 to 7 billions. It's even higher than humanitarian assistance within Syria, which before the cuts of the US were estimated around 2 billion within Syria, and not producing anything. Laith mentioned it. I had even estimates that in 2010, the level of export was 12 billion. Today, it's a billion. The trade deficit today is 3 to 4 billion, which is a huge pressure on the Syrian pound. This is without forgetting that you have instability of the Syrian pound and competition of the Syrian pound with the dollarization of the economy, the use of the Turkish pound, which is detrimental for any kind of foreign investment. Because if you invest and the Syrian pound will lose of its value in the future, you lose your investment, basically. So you have so many things. It's in terms of infrastructure, it's in terms of skilled workers, it's in terms of transparency. And again, we come back to the necessity of local participation. It's not normal that the reconstruction effort or attracting foreign investment is only in the hand of particular businessmen affiliated with the government or circles around it. What about the role of trade unions, professional associations like engineers, lawyers, etc.? This needs to be included as well as the civil society. So I think we really need to see the reconstruction effort in a more global sense, rather than only about saying, are the capacities present or not? Everything is to rebuild, definitely. But I mean, it's the global process that needs to be tackled more deeply, I believe so.
Thank you, Joseph. Natasha, I wonder if you would expand a bit on if you have observations on some of these issues that Joseph raised, and also if you could talk a little bit about your perceptions about what exactly is reconstruction. Is it just an economic plan or vision, or is it just a willy-nilly stream of foreign investment that comes in the way it seems to be coming in now? What should happen for a credible reconstruction plan for Syria?
Thank you, Ambassador. Yeah, I mean, I think Laith and Joseph spoke, at length about the MOUs that are being signed, 7 billion here or 6 billion there. A lot of what I see, and Joseph kind of glossed over who Hamsho is. Hamsho was al-Assad's sort of right-hand man that's responsible, amongst other things, for melting down a lot of the metal from forcibly displaced areas. So, some Syrians might have something to say about that. But, we're seeing people from within the current government, a handful of people controlling a lot of this through something called the committee. But we're also seeing a lot of former Assad regime cronies coming back, some of which have been forced to hand over about 80% of their assets, but still remain in Damascus and in sort of fortresses. And so, I think that they will continue to be part of this plan, which I think should caution all of us when we're looking at reconstruction. But beyond that, this isn't a mystery. It's complicated, but it's not a mystery. Syria is surrounded by cautionary tales. Joseph talked about this a bit. Iraq has had Iranian and Turkish goods dumped on it for many years now because it was never able to rebuild its industry and doesn't have the current measures in place to fight corruption. And that affects everything. That affects Iraq's ability to produce agricultural goods that are not as water intensive because Iran is dumping tomatoes on them. This isn't just about, cultural issues that, they want to stick to the same agricultural practices for years. This is about corruption that's been embedded over the reconstruction process that was never addressed. The fact that Iraq has electricity issues, an oil-rich country. Why aren't we asking questions about that? Why is it still flaring gas? Well, it's because of a lot of Iranian influence on the country. So when we think about foreign direct investment and we think about external influence, that has a big role to play in how reconstruction ends up happening and how sustainable economic development and political development, I would argue, is in a country. And Lebanon, Joseph mentioned that, but again, it's a poster child for what not to do. It's a country that is completely, has been dependent on tourism, real estate, financial services, has not invested in its production capabilities, and as a result is almost entirely dependent on imports to this day. And we saw what happened in 2019 and other times, what has happened in Lebanon as a result, right? And these were countries with a lot of investment, with a lot of also local capacity. Syria doesn't have that. And so I get very concerned that the sort of negotiating environment here is very off level. And they are going to have to take whatever MOU comes their way, regardless of what it looks like. And, unfortunately, when I see things like reconstruction of destroyed areas, it sounds good, but are we talking about housing, land, and property violations? Who's going to actually occupy that land once it's reconstructed? Is it going to be low-income housing for the people that used to live there, or is it going to be a Maratha-style development? And, you look at Lebanon, you look at what's going on in Baghdad right now, where the housing costs are astronomical. And we know what the answer is. If it's just private investment and a view to make short-term gains, it's not going to help the rest of society. Now, does the private sector have to have a big role in reconstruction? Absolutely. I mean, that's just necessary in this world, especially if the Syrian government doesn't want to take loans from the World Bank, et cetera. But there needs to be some kind of plan. And there is no plan. This is a patchwork of different deals that are being made around the country. And if we don't have that sort of economic reconstruction plan, which in fairness is not easy, right? Mm-hmm. There's a reason that the world has failed over and over again in multiple post-conflict environments. It's not an easy process, but if you have no plan, if there's no cohesive agreement on what the goals are moving forward, then you're certainly going to fail. And so that's kind of what I worry about here.
Natasha, we've been talking about the role of the international players affecting Syria, mostly focused on investment activity, and also some products being dumped and some financial issues with Turkey that Joseph referenced. I wonder, while we're talking about international players, though, if you could also comment on the role that Israel is playing or has played in Syria in the last 6 months or so. Not an investment role, but an important and not always helpful, not anywhere near helpful role. Could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. My most unfavorite subject. I wouldn't say, the 2 days after the fall of Assad, we saw about 600 strikes from Israel suddenly into Syria. So this has been ongoing for some time. And I don't think it's a secret that Israel has been sowing the seeds of dysfunction to accelerate state failure for the past several months and have been doing a great job in DC, although not great enough since Trump has decided to lift or relieve sanctions. But in DC, really trying to put pressure on various policymakers and stakeholders to support their view of what Syria and Ahmed al-Sharaa is. As everyone I think on the call knows, ground troops have advanced about 12 miles into Syrian territory. They've built about 9 military bases. They forcibly displaced people. They've expanded road networks and communications infrastructure. They have said that they're staying indefinitely. So the fact that I think, Ahmed al-Sharaa and his government are, I would say, being sort of forced into normalization talks with this hanging over it is really challenging. I would actually say that the most destructive role that I've seen being played is these very clear efforts to divide and break apart Syria. We can break down what happened in Sweda day by day. Happy to do that. I don't think we have the time to do that. But needless to say, there were mistakes across the board. But what ended up being an instance of highway robbery, literally highway robbery in the South, ended up spiraling completely out of control into this what is now perceived as sort of a sectarian violence, right? Which, in my view, didn't need to happen. You had tribes and possibly ISIS contingents coming from all over the country to come in and sow discord as well. And I think the issue is that Israel sees that. Israel sees a situation where there's, people from certain communities that feel like they have lost from the fall of Assad, that can be supported in their view to further divide the country and delay the process of unification of the country, which has been detrimental in the South. It's been detrimental in Kurdish areas, although I think the United States is much more committed, I think, to a plan of reunification there. But I think as long as you have Israel and I think other external players playing this role of destabilization, it makes me very nervous, because really it takes any massacre, it takes any incident to completely spiral out of control. And just to give a little bit more numbers to that. We saw 300,000 active social media accounts that were spreading disinformation on Twitter or X, when we've seen these spirals of violence like in the South, and primarily from 4 countries. I think we can imagine what those 4 countries are, right? Some of them posing as pro-government voices, promoting divisive narratives. There's a lot of fake accounts out there that are just sort of continuing to stir the pot. And that doesn't excuse, sort of delays on transitional justice or national reconciliation or more inclusivity, et cetera, all of the things that Joseph and Laith and others have pointed out. But to be clear, I think Ahmed al-Sharaa is reading the room. So I think to Joseph's initial point that nobody really wants a democracy in Syria of these external players, Israel foremost amongst them, he's doing what he needs to do to consolidate power and monopolize the use of violence, which is, I think what DC traditionally likes in the region. They want a good, strong man that they can rely on. And the fact that we have all of these, we have these stipulations, not necessarily conditions on sanctions being lifted, and very few of them relate to any of the issues that we've been talking about today, I think point to a situation where Ahmed al-Sharaa feels empowered. A lot of people feel empowered, whether or not they should actually feel empowered. So, I mean, I think the United States obviously has a role to play on the Israel side, and I think has tried, but has definitely been working at cross purposes. And just to, conclude with this point, we saw Marco Rubio, Secretary of State, asking the Syrian government to intervene in Sweda. Right? And then as government forces were going south, then Israel demanded that the government forces withdraw from Sweda and then started bombing. So, I think when you're having an ally work at cross purposes like that, you have a problem.
Thank you, Natasha. Laith, I wonder if you could comment a little bit on the point Natasha raised about the patchwork of everything that's going on so far. Investment, I wouldn't say it's somewhere between a trickle and pouring in. It's things are happening, but it's not. There's not much coordination. What is your sense about how you get better coordination and get a plan that would ensure that some of these things that Natasha and Joseph have talked about, making sure that the benefits of reconstruction get out to people and not to just either business elites or loyalists of the regime. Any suggestions on that?
I don't see that putting a plan together is a simple task with the current situation in Syria. Counting on Ahmed al-Shara and his government alone to put a plan together is difficult. You need the international organizations, including UNDP and other UN institutions, which are defunded by the US. At the same time, Ahmed al-Shara doesn't want to coordinate with the World Bank and the IMF. So some concessions need to be made on the side of Ahmed al-Shara to coordinate with the international community, international organizations, let's say, to put this plan together without asking them for technical assistance. I think it will be a difficult process, especially that people who are technocrats in the current government did not have a strong history of civil service, a long career in civil service. On the other side, when you look at the investors we mentioned earlier, whether from the Gulf or Europe, these are companies who are seeking profit at the end of the day. Yes, they are driven and motivated by their state's support that want a stable Syria. But to put this puzzle together, I think more effort from the international community has to be there. More US backing leadership and EU backing and leadership has to be there. The Gulf might need to use its multilateral institutions like the ISDP to sit down with the government of Syria and put a plan together. And I think in the lack of constitution, lack of inclusive process, we will end up with the same situation that we have currently. We saw the reports on Reuters about the so-called Abu Maryam and Hazem al-Shara, who were seizing assets from business tycoons and making deals with others in a non-transparent way. The third thing is, I think, regional powers has to come together. Someone has to facilitate some sort of a dialogue between Israel, Turkey, and Iran, and to some extent the Northeast Autonomous Government in Syria. So, for example, Turkey is making a lot of statements and spending a lot of political capital to say it support the current government, but I don't think Turkey is properly supporting rebuilding the Syrian economy. The second day after Ahmed al-Shara took the authority, we saw a massive reduction of customs on Turkish goods and products. This doesn't help Syria, as Joseph mentioned earlier. So there's some sort of a deficit of leadership. Each actor is acting alone. Al-Shara is not consulting properly with the civil society, is not cooperating properly with the international organization. You need some sort of leadership for those who have the biggest interests, like the EU and maybe the US. I think the EU, it's more difficult to the EU because when you need to make a US decision, EU decision or EU policy, you need everyone to agree on that decision. And you have different agendas in the EU. You have the Greece Cypriot agenda, you have the German French agenda, and so on and so forth. So, and when it comes to the US, I don't think the US is interested. The current administration, I wouldn't say the US, the current administration doesn't see the structural, sustainable sort of economic and political reforms as necessary for maintaining security and stability in Syria. They only focus on hardcore security that should be funded by the Gulf states, and that's it. So it's I think there's the current US administration is short-sighted. Europe is focused on Ukraine, and the Gulf is doing the best it can do at the moment.
Thank you, Laith. We're winding down towards the close of our discussion. I had one question from the audience. Natasha, just I wonder if you could give us a compact answer. It has to do with the role of non-jihadi militias in Syria, and what role are they playing now? They were instrumental also in the fall of Assad. Any comment from you about the role of these non-jihadi type militias?
It's hard to see things, I think, in black and white. I think that there's a bit of a spectrum. To say that there's non-jihadi/jihadi elements is could be a bit simplistic, because it, in a place with as desperate economic conditions as what we've been talking about, it doesn't take much to move somebody over to the other side, and that's kind of what we saw throughout the war. As a matter of fact, we saw a lot of people who weren't necessarily jihadists, but once your funder is of a certain makeup, then you move more extreme. Once you've had to dig your kids from out of rubble, one or two times, you become more extreme. So I don't know if I would say it in such simplistic terms. Ahmed Shara is probably one of the best examples of that. But what I would say is, from what we've learned over the course of the war, and I saw this happen in real time because I was trying to work with some of the more moderate groups to do trainings with them to mitigate civilian harm, etc. And what ended up happening is Russia intervened, and nobody really cared about what the rebel groups were doing anymore, because it seemed not as important, frankly, as bombs being dropped from planes, in fairness. And so what I worry about here, again, is that the security sector, we're going to have more demands, but without the support needed to meet those demands. You can't just simply create an army where everyone abides by the chain of command and everyone forgets the trauma and sectarian division of the past 14 years. The United States couldn't do that in Iraq with $1 trillion more. They couldn't stand up an army. They couldn't even rein in their own forces from committing abuses in a lot of cases. To think that Ahmed Shara can do that in Syria without real support is, I think, a fallacy. And to say that Turkey is going to be the only one to provide security sector support, with all due respect to Syria's northern neighbor, I mean, their experience with the Syrian National Army doesn't make me optimistic about what that ends up being for a Syrian army more broadly. It is very, very hard to do security sector reform in a place like Syria. And the fact that there is very little support going into Syria right now for sort of a unified or even a federalized, whatever it happens to end up being, security sector makes me even more nervous, because what we'll see is exactly what we saw during the war, which is various different elements that I just sort of mentioned in the last answer, funding their guy. And that's going to lead to more chaos as well.
Thank you, Natasha. So I'd like to give each of you a couple of minutes to wrap up and emphasize any points that you'd like to, or point to the future. It's up to you. Joseph, shall we start with you?
Thank you, Ambassador. I think these three main points to put forward in order to witness, hopefully in the future in Syria, a real democratic and inclusive political transition process and forms of social justice within reconstruction effort, to prevent any actually coming back to the sources of the Syrian uprising in 2011, which was the absence of democracy and absence of social justice and development. And first of all, it's the building of a civil society in the broader sense of the matter. Democratic political parties, trade unions, professional associations, But also when I say inclusive, it's not about putting, one Kurdish, one Alawite, and whatever else. It's about the political stratum being included. For example, and I totally agree with Natasha that Israel has been, instrumentalizing sectarian tensions in Syria as they did, in Lebanon. They've been doing this for decades. But the ability to do this is because the current government is acting in an exclusive way. For example, if we take again the case of Sweden. Sweden had nominated, so Sweden, when I mean the local political forces, armed forces, religious dignitaries, at the beginning of the year, their own representative, a woman. It was denied by the local government that decided to nominate its own governor. Why so? What kind of national unity can be made if there's no particular promotion of inclusivity at the locus level? And this is the same for the Northeast. And I don't believe it's fair to say that the massacres in the coastal areas or the latest event in Sweden is an accident. No, it is a policy really clear to mobilize certain sectors of the population in a sectarian way to control areas that are outside or where you see challenges to the government. And sectarianism is not something that is rooted within the population, but it's something that is constructed, produced by the main central production of power that is today this government. Similarly, if we look at the security sector, the best way to achieve security in Syria is the path towards real national unity, but share power, therefore. Why do you not share power with Sweden, with the Northeast? This kind of actions actually create more insecurity. If you have a new army that is based only on loyalists, not only on a particular sect, Arab Sunnis, but on particular loyalists, you exclude others. How will you increase security within Syria? Here, the first path is definitely the building of a strong civil society and that will push for concessions, because it's important to say to donors, to Western actors, Gulf, that we need a more inclusive political process. But if the government doesn't feel any form of pressure from below, a counter society to face it, why will it do so? Not even in liberal democracies, if there's no form of strong civil society, strong social movements, there's no concessions. The second, I think, and this is to link it to the maybe more social justice, two main points I think that are important: a reform of the fiscal system. Currently, we have a reform that is pointing towards a form of flat system. Most of the economies of the region are based on indirect form of taxes, TVA, which is the most regressive and unjust, and very small collecting revenues on a progressive basis. If we reform the tax system in order to expand the fiscal basis, we could use these revenues for the security sector, but more importantly, to invest in the public sector, education and health, and the productive sectors of the economy, which has the biggest multiplier effect: industry and agriculture. I think these are the key points to put forward, in order also to increase, if you want, the national sovereignty of the country. Basically, democracy accompanied with forms of economic development benefiting the vast majority that can participate in the political transition if they see an improvement of the socio-economic conditions. Otherwise, we will have a reconstruction effort and process led by a small minority, in an exclusive way, which is the path for new instability and authoritarian dynamics.
Thank you, Joseph. Laith?
Thank you, Ambassador. I maybe to put things in a different way. For sure, there are infinite. If we want to think about scenarios, there are infinite scenarios that could happen in Syria, that can happen in Syria. But I don't think the overall picture as gloom as we might think. So when it comes to inclusivity and national dialogue and so on, I think if al-Shara accelerates the the constitution drafting process and elections and building the parliament and all the checks and balances systems, he will end up in a way that solves the Druze problems, because as Joseph mentioned, at the end of the day, as a minority, when you look at the Druze and you ask them to hand their weapons without a constitution that protects them, without checks and balances that protect them, for sure they will ask Israel for help. And the same comes to when it comes to the North East Syria Autonomous Government and the SDF. The SDF is trained on Western systems. They have their own governance mechanisms. They have their own security trainings and so on. And they've been there even before the HTS. So you can't get into agreement with these people if you don't match the level of reform and governance that they have. And at the end of the day, you also need, for reconstruction, you also need to get to an agreement with SDF to share the oil revenues. Now, they are sharing the oil revenues, but we don't know the details of it, and we don't know whether this is sustainable or not. So reform is key. The second thing that I would emphasize is that, last year when al-Assad fell, the al-Assad regime collapsed, Syria became on the international table again. I think al-Shara and his government has to sustain their effort in keeping Syria on the international table and asking international actors actively to mediate between these competing powers in Syria, because without putting some sort of an agreement on what everyone wants from Syria, I think the situation will continue as is. Israel, at the end of the day, especially after the 7th of October, is interested in being the regional hegemon and is interested in maintaining conflict and wars outside of its borders. Iran has its own interests in Syria and Lebanon, and the same applies to Turkey. So without international effort and regional effort to come to a conclusion on where Syria should go, and without an internal process in Syria, I don't think things will improve. But I think the fundamentals of building better Syria are there. The international interest is there. The regional willingness is there. It's only how to put it all together in a productive way.
Thank you, Laith. Natasha, final comment?
Yeah, I'll just take a few seconds. I just want to emphasize what a small window of opportunity this is, and it is an opportunity. A few months ago, Bashar al-Assad was in power, and Syria was just going to wither away. It really seemed hopeless, and now there is a moment of hope, but that window is really, really small. And I've worked in conflict-affected countries all over the world. There isn't an equation for every country, but that window is very small until people start consolidating their fiefdoms, and entrenched political and economic ways, end up happening, and we see the consequences for them for the longer term. This is the moment when all of the parties are more vulnerable, more open to compromise, because they have to be. And if that window closes, it's going to be very, very difficult to reverse. So that's a very broad statement, but I wanted to keep it short. But I think we need to keep that in mind moving forward.
Very, very useful final point. I want to thank our panel for a brilliant discussion. These are difficult issues. I think we aired a lot of the complexity and got into some of the challenges that lie ahead for Syria and its reconstruction efforts. Thank you again, and thank you to our audience for listening, and we welcome you to join us for our next program. Thank you all very much.